So, you wait for that, okay, now back again, let's scale to year reductions.
The whole second year.
Twice. Yeah, so now there at the moment. But I'm still pretty hopeful. I think it's tough. But
yeah.
it's all about we're being left behind. Talk about asymmetric bends.
So tell.
Yeah, right. You a crypto guy at all?
No, I've watched the explainer video like 3 times.
Right.
Everyone, sorry for the slightly late sorry for the confusion.
Yeah.
The room.
Yeah, but at least you've done the work.
Already for the reimagining, which doesn't yes, there is some delays. But I think we're ready to start. Everyone is ready. Yeah, so thanks. My name's Fadil Elabaid. I'm the Africa Engagement Program Manager at the Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa. Some brief housekeeping rules, just keep your phones on silent. We'll be taking photos and it's being recorded to be shared online afterwards. So just we assume that you being here means consent. So if you don't consent to that, then yeah, you would have to leave, unfortunately. And then also, yeah, please give us a follow on social media at Africa LSE. Yeah, this event is been conceived to be involved with capitalism and imperialism in Africa as past and present at a time where many Black History Month events seem to focus on like Black identity through capitalism and corporate identities. So yeah, we've got a great panel for you today. Unfortunately, Professor Ray Bush can't make it today as he's quite ill. But we'll be still making a sort of reference to the special issue on imperialism from the Review of African Political Economy that the event was sort of supposed to be collaborating with. A quick thank you to the partners, the LSE Students Union, SOAS Centre of Pan-African Studies, and Daniel, of course, and the RTP who are here. Yeah, so yeah, I'll just pass over to our chair, Dr. Sarah Salem, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology at LSE. His research includes sociology, postcolonial studies, Marxist theory, feminist theory, global histories of empire and imperialism, and has worked with the Sociological Review and historical materials and journals. So yeah, over to you, Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this really exciting event. It's really nice to see so many people. And before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to briefly make reference to Professor Ray Bush's intervention, which would have been around the new issue of the Review of African Political Economy that's entitled Imperialism and Africa. So this is the 50th anniversary issue of the journal. And the aim of this issue is to focus on imperialism in the African context and beyond, remind readers, scholars, writers of the structural underpinning to the world economy that produces and reproduces inequality, poverty, war, and famine, and yet that is omitted from almost all analysis of Africa. This issue aims to interrogate what imperialism is, but also how it's changed over time and what the consequences of it continue to be. And I just want to quote from the first issue of the Review of African Political Economy, which was published in 1974. And these are words by Samir Amin, who many of you might know as one of the kind of big founders of thinking about capitalism, dependency theory, and Marxism in the context of Africa. And he writes, the aim of starting this review is to express intent and of providing a counterweight to the mass literature in Africa, which holds that Africa's continuing poverty is primarily an internal problem and not a product of colonial history or present dependence. It also holds that the successful attraction of foreign capital and the consequent production within the confines of the international market as a myth that will bring about development needs to be interrogated. And it also criticizes the idea that the major role in achieving development must be played by modernizing elites who bring progress to the quote unquote masses. This editorial also shed light on leaders who inherited power at independence, confirming Frantz Fanon's description of them as the children of yesterday's colonialism and today's national governments. The Review of African Political Economy, and I really encourage you to have a look at it, is one of the most important spaces that draws attention to colonial, neo-colonial, and capitalist violence, which is the topic of today's conversation. From the violence of capitalist extraction and neo-colonialism in Sudan and Congo to the global ramifications of Israel's current genocide, continual land theft in Palestine, the journal calls attention to why it's important for us to think about the evolving nature of empire across Africa and beyond. In the words of Patrice Lumumba, who was the first leader of independent Congo, assassinated by the CIA and the Belgian state, quote, "The only thing which we wanted for our country is the right to a worthy life, to dignity without pretense, to independence without restrictions," end quote. I'm going to introduce our two speakers who will each speak, and after that, we're going to open up to a Q&A, and we really hope to have a rich discussion. So first, we have Daniel Mulugeta, who is a UKRI Future Leaders Fellow and Lecturer in International Politics of Africa at SOAS University of London. He also serves as the chair of the SOAS Center for Pan-African Studies. And second, we have Fiona Lalji, who is the campaigns coordinator for the Revolutionary Communist Party. Best known for her live debate with Suella Braverman, many of you I'm sure have seen. She's been active in the recent Palestine protests, as well as writing and speaking about imperialism and racism from a Marxist perspective. So please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Today, the topic of my speech is less about Pan-African imperialism and more about African and African diaspora in response to imperialism and capitalism. That's why I'm invoking the whole idea of Pan-Africanism, a concept that remains very controversial, provocative, especially in academic circles and elite policy making spaces in the West. It's often stigmatized as a racialized ideology. Indeed, when it first emerged in the 90s and 20th centuries, Pan-Africanism focused primarily on cultural and racial relations. However, Pan-Africanism has a long, complex history that's inseparable from the forces of empire and imperialism. At the core, Pan-Africanism stands in direct opposition to imperialism. So by definition, Pan-Africanism is against imperialism. So whether one follows Nkrumah's vision of a United States of Africa or another version, the essence of Pan-Africanism is rooted in political, economic, cultural liberation, all in opposition to imperialism. So we could have this well-articulated understanding of Pan-Africanism in early years through the Pan-African congresses organized by Du Bois. Although they kind of proposed modest intervention by imperialist powers, what they demanded was the extension of the self-determination and self-governance for the people of Africa and liberation for people of African descent in the diaspora. However, Pan-Africanism as a movement was never a call for exclusivity or isolationism, but rather it was a call for Africa's equal participation in the global system. For George Parmore, for example, one of the organizers of the fifth Manchester Pan-African Congress and mentor of Kwame Nkrumah, Pan-Africanism was not simply about African unity or African liberation, but a mechanism to overthrow imperialism and advance global socialist order. So it was sort of methodology rather than an end game. So Parmore even saw potential in transforming the British Empire into a socialist commonwealth, where colonies could have greater autonomy, but remain part of a socialist world federation. So he kind of saw an alternative future for the British Empire where it could follow a socialist path toward decolonization. So something similar to the Soviets, the USSR transformation from Russian Empire into a socialist federation of republics. So the destinies of the global North and the global South were and are interconnected, particularly through the shared struggles of the working class in the metropolis and in the colonies. So as Edom Getachew in her research book has argued, Pan-Africanism was a project of world making aimed at reordering the global system along egalitarian lines. So this vision wasn't exclusively to English-speaking Pan-Africanists. For instance, Senghor, who was the first president of Senegal, who did not explicitly identify himself as a Pan-Africanist, advocated for African federations and reimagined African-European relations to create what he called the civilization of the universal. So he lamented the balkanization of the French Africa's two federations, the French West Africa and the French Equatorial Africa. Although they were they had colonial origins, he saw federation as a stepping stone to building stronger African economies and stronger African place in the global system. However, unlike Nkrumah's vision of Pan-Africanism, Senghor envisaged Africa's federations maintaining a unilateral associations with metropolitan economies, especially with France. So the vision of Pan-Africanism has always been rooted in anti-imperialism, and this was explicit in the resolution of the 1945 Fifth Pan-African Congress, which took place in Manchester, which saw for the first time the participation of a large number of future African leaders, including Jomo Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah, and others. So this anti-imperial stance was brought to the continent with Nkrumah, and Ghana's independence on March 6, 1957, marked a significant triumph for Pan-Africanism. So Nkrumah's declaration in 1957 at Ghana's independence celebration that Ghana would be a sponsor of African liberation marked the first time Pan-Africanism was made the official ideology of a nation state. So between 1957 and 58, Ghana became the hub for African nationalist movements. So Ghana sponsored Ghana continued to support for African liberation, not as a matter of rhetoric, but it was institutionalized. So Nkrumah offered financial aid, training, and ideological support to political refugees and for liberation fighters across the continent. So this policy crystallized in the organization of two key conferences, the Conference of Independent African States and the All-African People's Conference in Accra in 1958. For the first time, Pan-Africanism entered formal state-level politics and extended beyond Black Africa to encompass the entire continent and its diaspora. So these conferences explicitly addressed not just the immediate problem of colonialism at the time, but the lingering presence of neocolonialism and imperialism. So it's important to note that Nkrumah and his mentor, Palmore, who was his African affairs advisor at the time, Pan-Africanism was uniquely framed as an African anti-imperialist movement. By this, I mean they rejected not just Western capitalism, but also Soviet-style communism. So they were against the excesses of Stalinism. So they instead advocated for a non-aligned socialist development for Africa, a philosophy Nkrumah would later call African socialism. However, this vision of Pan-Africanism was severely tested during the Cold War, as many African countries were forced to align with either the US or the USSR due to economic and military pressure, obviously. So with the formation of the Organization of African Unity, which was established in 1963, which was seen as a step towards African unity, but it failed to to kind of materialize the anti-imperial Pan-African agenda of Nkrumah hoped for. So the OAU, sorry, had two major objectives as articulated by Julius Nyerere later on. The first one was to liberate the continent from colonialism, and the second one to unite Africa. Instead, one of its greatest achievements was creation of the Liberation Committee in 1963, with the founding of the OAU, which supported the fight against colonial rule in Southern Africa and apartheid in South Africa. So African leaders at the time somehow succeeded in liberating the continent from direct colonial occupation, but they failed to unite it. More importantly, to me, they failed to articulate a strong anti-imperial vision. The OAU was primarily targeted colonialism rather than imperialism. It was only Nkrumah who kind of focused on neo-colonialism and imperialism. However, even Nkrumah, in my view, his anti-colonial and anti-imperial articulation of Pan-Africanism was overshadowed by his somehow stubborn stance on African unity as a means to achieve this goal, rather than pursuing other alternatives. So this alienated him from other African leaders, including radical ones like Nyerere. So Nkrumah believed that political unification should come first. It should precede economic cooperation. He argues that the uneven development inherited from colonialism made economic cooperation alone impractical in Africa. He was concerned that delaying political unity would leave African states vulnerable to neo-colonialism. So for him, politics always trumps economics. So Nyerere, on the other hand, was concerned that the locally vested interests and the pursuit of sovereignty represented by flag and state power were the major impediments to unification. So for Nyerere, economic cooperation was the most and the more realistic starting point in the fight against imperialism. So despite the ideological momentum created by such debates during the mid-20th century, Africa entered the era of coups, dictatorships, Cold War politics, which turned Pan-Africanism into little more than a slogan. African leaders who were not part of the Pan-African movement used Pan-Africanism to entrench authoritarianism, whether through the performance of culture, wearing certain kind of leopard skin, for example, or deploying tokenistic anti-Westernism to escape political accountability. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the bipolar world collapsed, we know what just followed. The rise of neoliberal policies through the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization came to dominate African states. This started with the structural adjustment program in the early 1980s that enforced neoliberal economic conditions, but stripped African states of political self-determination over their economic policies. So in the early 2000s, the transition from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union was also disappointing. While new political and economic institutions like NEPAD were created, they were not rooted in the anti-imperial tradition of Pan-Africanism, and instead reflected Africa's marginalization on the global stage. Well, all was not bad. There have been some positive initiatives as part of the transition to the African Union, such as the Constitutive Act of the AU, has provisions that allow the right to intervene in cases of mass atrocities like war crimes, genocide, crime against humanity. And we have the African peer review mechanism, kind of the voluntary self-monitoring tool for African leaders to assess governance in human rights standards. Nevertheless, Africa remains marginal in the global system. It's marginalized from key discussions on climate crisis, which disproportionately affects the continent, and underrepresented or not represented at all in international multilateral institutions, international financial institutions, where African issues are discussed and debated. Well, as President Nyerere once noted, the big question is always, is this country pro-East or pro-West? Africa is still viewed as having no ideas of its own, no interests of its own. So today, Pan-Africanism has evolved from an anti-imperialist strategy into somehow a development program, influenced by more by neoliberal economic ideals, like regional integration, free trade, and so on, than the anti-imperial political unity that once defined it. Thank you very much.
Time myself. Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit more about, I guess, imperialism in Africa today and what that looks like. I think that flows really well from this kind of history of Pan-Africanism, what the content of that should actually be, how to move beyond slogans and aesthetics. That's something I'm very interested in, particularly because I would say the most genuine form of anti-imperialism ultimately has to be a socialist anti-imperialism. There's different forms of anti-imperialist figures that exist out there, but not all of them have a clear idea of what kind of economy are you actually trying to build. And I think that lies at the heart of some of the problems perhaps that we've seen in the past. But yeah, to discuss imperialism in Africa is obviously probably a task that requires a lifetime of study, and that is work that should be done. But what I'm going to focus on is maybe trying to draw out some of the general processes that are taking place currently. And I think if we start with West Africa, what we should look at is basically the collapse of French imperialism, the kind of relative decline that Western imperialism has been going through all over the world, but particularly in Africa in the last year or so. I think we should really emphasize that it's a relative decline. We can't exaggerate that. I think Western imperialism today by far remains the most dominant, most reactionary imperialist power on the planet that produces misery all over the world. There's no doubt about that. But it is true that it's been going through a relative decline in the last 5 to 10 years. And what you have all over the world is spaces opening up, in Africa in particular, where other powers are able to take up some of that space in a smaller sense. And in Africa, in certain African countries and regions of Africa, I would say that's clearly China and Russia, who are able to take advantage of the vacuum that is opening up. And we have to examine what that is and also be able to define what that is, even if it's slightly different in the way that it looks. Just because it's not Western imperialism, it doesn't mean that it's somehow inherently more progressive. Would be one of the arguments that I would want to make. But yeah, Western imperialism remains this dominant power, clearly militarily as well, all over the world. Its kind of grip and its spheres of influence that it tries to maintain have been breaking down for a certain period. I mean, look, I come from the perspective of Marxism. In short, to be crude, I think the solution to the hyper-exploitation of the African masses, the solution to that lies in the African masses themselves, kicking out all forms of imperialism all across Africa and being able to actually control their lives and actually have a say over what is taking place. And that is true all over the world, no matter where you look. And that includes this vacuum. And the reason I wanted to start by that is because over the last month or so, I've been on a tour of universities. It's called Books Not Bombs tour, where we argue for books and not bombs, healthcare and not warfare, this kind of thing. Because I think we're living through a moment where young people especially are thinking about anti-imperialism. And because of the most barbaric scenes that we're seeing in Gaza and Beirut every single day,
we're thinking about imperialism correctly, but in its most extreme form, which is war, which is bombs, which is complete massacres in a really violent, naked sense. But obviously, we need to understand imperialism exists every single day through the World Bank and through the IMF and through the way the whole of capitalism is set up. And that also produces violence and massacres and also barbarism in African countries. But the more long-standing problem is the whole nature of the system itself and this hyper-exploitation, which is a legacy of colonialism, which has never gone away in a meaningful sense. And I think that because today capitalism is in quite a deep crisis, and what I mean by that is the world economy is in quite a deep crisis, and you don't have to take that from me. The World Bank has said that the first half of the 2020s will be the slowest growth in the world economy for the last 30 years. And when the world economy is growing, it's much easier for the capitalists to exist peacefully with one another. But when the economy is slowing or even shrinking in some places, capitalists begin to fight more over their share of the market. And I think we are seeing that in African countries and in the development of proxy wars all over the place. The desperate need to maintain influence and maintain access to things is being expressed, I would say, particularly in Congo. But I'll come on to that. This economic turbulence is expressing itself politically, and that is inevitable. But obviously that political manifestation is fractured through the different traditions of different countries, the history of the class struggle in that country, for example, the political ideas or forces that exist. So it's not going to look exactly the same everywhere, but my argument is that the same fundamental process is taking place all over the world. And it starts first and foremost with this economic slowdown and this problem in the world economy. There's a greater struggle over markets, as I said. I mean, if we look at foreign direct investment in Africa, obviously there's the usual people you might expect, France, Britain, and so on and so forth. But as I said, you also have China, which is investing more and more in Africa than ever before. What we see, therefore, is a greater amount of inter-imperialist struggles all over the world, and particularly within Africa and within these African countries. You've got these powers outside of Africa that come in for their own reasons, for resources, spheres of influence, labor, and so on and so forth. But then within these countries themselves, there's different groups, organizations, gangs, militias, whatever you want to call them, that are also trying to maintain some kind of control of the situation. And all of this produces more instability, which produces more misery for people on the ground. And I want to start by this because it is an idea on the left by some people, multipolarity, as a kind of solution to the dominance of Western imperialism on the world stage. But I actually think the addition of more powers and more imperialist powers onto the world isn't the solution. Actually, it produces more instability, more conflict, and most importantly, more misery and a greater degradation in the conditions that people face all over the world in terms of the masses themselves. So we're seeing this greater fight over the share of resources. But because Africa has been plundered for so long by imperialism, it obviously follows that Africa has also seen huge waves of anti-imperialism. We've just heard all about that. But that anti-imperialism doesn't always have an organized expression. And it doesn't seem to have as much of an organized expression today in the form, and what do I mean by organized expression? You can have parties or you can have individuals, right? Individuals, I think, often are a reflection of the moment that they're living through. I don't really believe that some people are just magical geniuses that come onto the stage of history and are able to change everything in front of them. I think most people are the product of their environment and the product of revolutionary movements themselves. So in the past, we had people like Nkrumah, Lumumba, Sankara, Cabral, all of these figures. But when you look at anti-imperialism in Africa today, these sorts of figures don't really exist. There's people who pay lip service to them, and that's good, that's fine. But in terms of like revolutionary fighters, the question we should ask is, where are they? And I think the question then lies is, where is the revolutionary movement? That is what throws up figures like Nkrumah or whoever else, despite the flaws and critiques that we might have of them. But I think now, because of the crisis of capitalism, because of the conditions that it's producing in Africa and all over the world, I think that's going to change. I think we are living through an important turning point where more mass movements are on the order of the day. That doesn't mean it's going to take place tomorrow, and I can't stand here and give you a date for the great Pan-African revolution that will sweep away all imperialism. But I do truly believe that the conditions of the world are producing convulsions in society that are trying to express themselves in different forms. And if we look at the Sahel region and we look at West Africa, in particular, I think last year was a distorted expression of this in terms of the coups that took place and the kind of booting out of French imperialism in countries like Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso and so on and so forth. Where did that come from? Well, first and foremost, there is a deep-rooted loathing of French imperialism in these places, which is understandable. I think you cannot underestimate this, especially amongst young people. I mean, French imperialism has absolutely decimated these countries for decades and decades and decades. France maintained a huge stranglehold across the whole of Francophone Africa, if you want to call it that, to try and maintain this kind of bastion, this sphere of influence that it wanted to have. And what's interesting is if you look at the quotes of different French presidents over the last 10 to 15 years, it's all of them talking about how important it is that they don't lose Africa. So in 2008, former French president Jacques Chirac, he said, without Africa, France will slide down into the rank of a third world power. And then his predecessor said, without Africa, France will have no history in the 21st century. And then Macron, when he first became president, he said that we need to convince our compatriots that France's power is not declining, but that we are on the threshold of an extraordinary renaissance. Now, ever since then, French imperialism has just declined all across that region, economically, geopolitically, and militarily. And as I say, I think these coups that took place showed an expression of this political process that is taking place, above all amongst the youth, above all amongst young people. Because these coups were actually very popular after they took place, right? There were mass protests in support of them. It was this feeling of, yes, finally someone is doing something, which is very important and very significant. Despite the fact that I'm a revolutionary communist, I'm a revolutionary Marxist, these coups are not what I see as the solution to the problems of what is taking place. But you've got to recognize the balance of forces in society and the mood that it is creating. And this absolute hatred of Western imperialism. And the problem is sometimes, you know, and I have my critiques, very necessary and very relevant, of China and even of Russia, but it doesn't, in terms of the mood amongst the masses, the consciousness of imperialism in Africa, China and Russia don't play the exact same role. And that's because, especially when we think about this idea of neo-colonialism, what French colonialism in particular has done, and Western colonialism or European imperialism by extension, the consequences of that were felt for decades and decades. For example, for decades, there was about 14 Western and Central African countries who had their national reserves held by the French Central Bank under essentially colonial monetary agreements. There's a whole list of countries where the banks controlled everything. So what you have is these small, weak economies that were trapped in a cycle of indebtedness. And then to cover more costs, what could they do? They would just have to borrow more money, but they had to borrow the money from the same French banks with conditions, with interest, or you could get development aid. But what was that development aid come with? More conditions, loans and interest, yes, but also conditions that you had to use French contracts, you had to use French companies, whatever it was that they wanted to do. So French imperialism was benefiting twice in terms of the loans and the interest that it was performing, but also the content of what that loan even was for. And there was also the access to resources. You know, France maintained for a long time the right to have the first access to certain resources in any of its ex-colonial territories. Uranium is a good example of this in Niger in particular, which played a role in the recent actions last year as well, in the mood to kick the French out and people to have control over their resources. That's why when these coups took place in the West and France, like, oh, it's very democratic, I don't really like it. It's so hypocritical and it's nauseating and it doesn't mean anything to people because the whole region and the misery and the violence that exists in the region is the product of Western imperialism and the French most recently and the British obviously historically for decades and decades and decades. It is precisely centuries really of imperialist exploitation and meddling in the region that has prepared the ground for everything that is taking place today. But what is the state of these regimes, okay, in places like Burkina Faso and Niger and so on and so forth? You can kick out officers and kick out troops, but that alone is not enough. None of these regimes have fundamentally been able to break with capitalism or expropriate the multinationals that continue to exploit the region. And that brings us on to Congo, which is the most extreme example of how different imperialist powers and then also internal groups produce misery, which flows from the logic of capitalism itself. But also back to this idea of debt, actually. You know, one of the leaders in Burkina Faso, you know, paying tribute to Thomas Sankara. And there's a clear difference between them, right? When Sankara spoke about debt and neocolonialism, he appealed very concretely to all of the rest of the African leaders and he said, do not pay back the debt. Do not pay it in any way, shape or form. And he said, actually at me, he said, if Burkina Faso does this alone, I won't be here next year to make the same arguments. And he wasn't there the next year, which is another important aspect as to how interconnected all of this is. A struggle can't take place in one country alone. So there is a difference. Sankara went much, much further than what those current regimes are doing. He was nationalizing, you know, whole parts of industry, cutting the wages of civil servants to try and stop corruption and so on and so forth, putting forward this bold anti-imperialist message. Anyway, that's kind of by the by. So if we look at Congo, which is home to more than 70% of the world's coltan, which is essentially processed into a metal, which is used in electronic devices such as phones, laptops, modern military equipment, and so on and so forth. And to get this resource, you have, you know, millions of people who are forced to mine it in the way that they can. This obviously isn't safe, secure work. I'm sure you don't need to convince you of that. Children are often involved in this, having to dig with shovels and also sometimes their bare hands. And the pit owners, what they do is they sell what they get to some kind of middlemen. There's all different words and terms for it, but I'm running out of time, so I'm trying to speed up a little bit. And they sell this on to traders that are usually financed by foreign backers who then sell it on for processing elsewhere. So there's this kind of web that exists that starts with, you know, the most horrible conditions for people mining it, the people who own the pits selling it on to more and more. Then you've got the countries surrounding like Rwanda and Uganda, which scrape off what they can, but then even that is minimal in comparison to what the massive corporations, which ultimately end up in Apple and Hawaii and all these types of country, what they gain from getting access to those resources. So you have this web, and the main profiteers are the Western multinational corporations. China also plays a massive role in Congo as well, and we should say that. But it's this web, essentially, of imperialism and exploitation. And what is the way out of that? What is the way out of that is the question that we have to ask ourselves, because it's not enough to kind of just talk about awareness, I would say, in an abstract sense. You know, in the Palestine movement now, there's this big idea, and it comes from the right place, it comes from a moral place, I think, where, you know, you go on protests, people say, free Palestine, and they say, and Congo, and Sudan, and they just kind of add it on at the end, which I understand. It's because people are trying to see the connection between imperialism all over the world, and that's a good thing. But ultimately, there's so many roles, so many different imperialist powers, and then internal conflicts taking place in these countries. It's not enough to just use these slogans. Like, ultimately, what our work should be, I would say, is trying to build the forces necessary to empower the people on the grounds themselves to be involved in the type of activity and the type of action that is kicking these people out. There's a role that you can play from the belly of the beast, if you want to call it that, right, against your own imperialist powers. That is absolutely vital. But it's the people on the ground themselves that have to be empowered in order to make the most kind of effective blow against this kind of ecosystem of exploitation that exists. So whenever there is a vacuum, that vacuum is going to be filled. And my argument is that the most effective way for change to happen is only if that vacuum is filled by a revolutionary movement of the masses themselves. In the absence of that, in the world today, that vacuum is going to continue to be filled by different competing imperialist powers, and that is not a solution. And we shouldn't look to those countries as lesser evils as the way forward. Sudan is perhaps one of the most tragic examples of somewhere where actually there was a revolutionary movement of the masses, but because that revolutionary movement ultimately was unsuccessful, because there wasn't a force there to take power into the hands of the masses themselves, it has descended back into that tug of war for power between different groups, and in which the genuine needs and the genuine interests of the masses have been ignored and unable to be answered or solved. Without a revolutionary organization or a revolutionary party, that vacuum will not be taken advantage of. And I'll end on a positive note, I think, which is that, because I'm talking about revolutionary movements, and we can talk about this, like what are the perspectives for that across the whole of the African continent? I would say we should remember that more than 60% of the population on the entire continent is under the age of 25 years old, which makes it one of the youngest continents in the world. And I was talking to someone just earlier about how this idea of like the Gen Z revolution that's been popping up in the news, but I also think is real. Not because I think young people today are inherently more moral, but the conditions of the world are forcing them into struggle. And specifically in Africa and in African countries, where, as has been alluded to, you have these African leaders who try and use their anti-colonial struggles from their credentials from 20, 30 years ago. That means nothing if you're a 19, 20-year-old who has only experienced, I'm from Uganda, Museveni has been in power my whole life. You can't use a struggle of 30, 40 years ago as your weapon against the people that you are currently oppressing, and you are involved in siphoning off all of the super profits to Western imperialism. And so I think the youngness on that continent and the conditions that capitalism is producing means those people will be forced into struggle. We saw that in Kenya, we saw that in Nigeria, we see it all over the world. And for me, that is where the solution lies, and that is where I'm the most positive. But it won't be passive, it won't happen arbitrarily, it will only come about through organization. So we should do everything we can to support the organization of revolutionaries within Africa itself.
Thank you both so much. So we have quite a bit of time for discussion, and just a gentle reminder to keep the questions comradely, constructive, and not too long. So maybe before we go to the floors, I'll give you a few minutes to kind of put your questions together. I had a question for the two panelists. So I mean, the first thing that I was thinking about during both of your talks was this point about multipolarity as not necessarily being a solution. And I was really interested in your thoughts around things like BRICS. So the kind of this rise of the global South economic powerhouses, and how you read that in light of what you're both saying, right? That we have lost a lot of the revolutionary energy of the past few decades, but we do see these attempts that almost kind of represent themselves as a new version of that, but of course have their own kind of problems. So I was curious about these types of movements. And the other question that I had was around the history of Pan-Africanism in particular, was also the role of internationalism. And I think, you kind of ended with this point that we see a lot of resistance and uprisings across Africa and across many parts of the world, and yet you know, if we look at the 50s and 60s, there was this idea that we also need a global revolution to happen, right? That when it's kind of isolated, it's much easier for counter-revolutionary forces to take power. And I think over the last decade, we've seen almost, you know, an increase in the number of these movements across Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and yet often they're met with quite brutal and violent counter-revolutions. So I was curious also about how you see this role of internationalism. Is there something that we, for example, here in the UK that, you know, as you both mentioned, is very much complicit in a lot of the genocidal and political violence across the continent? What is the role also of this question of internationalism, in the sense that we think about Pan-Africanism, there was this idea of the tricontinental, the connections between Afro-Asia, and there's something also that has been lost in that sense that we could recover in the past. Hand over that to you, and then we'll take a round of audience questions.
Can I go first?
Oh, that was it.
Yeah.
Now?
Yes.
Okay. From here. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, BRICS. That's the example that people use, and I can understand when people are excited about, you know, any kind of force that seems to be moving against or is able to weaken, as I said, Western imperialism. And it's clear that China has done that in many forms. The rise of China has limited to a certain degree, particularly America's role in brokering deals and trying to be key player. But how does that help the masses on the ground is the question that we have to ask ourselves, in terms of maintaining a class perspective rather than accepting the framework of capitalism. And also it depends, I would say China is a capitalist country and has a capitalist economy. There's some people who would say that's not the case. I would disagree with them. I think China's economy is obviously capitalist. And I understand imperialism as not just an ideology, but a logical product of the capitalist system itself, and the need to go beyond the limits of your own market, your own nation state, and export your capital. And that is why China's actions, I would argue, in Africa, even though it looks very different from historically what Britain and France and Europe did, and even how America kind of operates, but ultimately is in place. And what is the logical trajectory? What is the trajectory of travel for these countries? And I think when you take that all together, then you cannot justify support for a different capitalist imperialist power as a way forward in terms of helping people. And in regards to internationalism, yeah, I think this is really important. I think every nationalist struggle, whether it's within Africa or black nationalism in America, which obviously is very linked and was very inspired by the colonial revolutions in Africa, Black Panthers and so on and so forth. Every single one of these movements at a certain point, you know, is confronted with very clear class questions beyond just general anti-imperialism, which is like, what is the economic basis of the type of society that we're trying to create? And has tried to grapple with that. I did a talk a couple of years ago, which was maybe quite provocatively titled "Marxism versus Black Nationalism," and people were like, "Well, why have you created this binary between these two things?" Because Black nationalism, Pan-Africanism, that has always had a kind of revolutionary side to it and a revolutionary element to it that has gone in a Marxist direction in some cases. But it's never been fully complete. It's never been fully conscious and had an idea of where it's going. And I think that is the inherent weakness. So internationalism is vital, but I think we're going to see that more and more in the world, in the struggles and the revolutions that I think. Sorry, I don't know what I'm doing here. Why am I doing this? But okay, I think we're going to see revolutions more and more across the world in our lifetimes, and there's a certain organic way in which that will take place. But the question is, will it be will it be conscious, and will there be parties or leaders that have a conscious idea of where it's going? So yeah, I don't think BRICS is the answer. I think internationalism is the lifeblood of any successful world revolution. You cannot, I would say you cannot have socialism in one country. You can't build it on that basis if that's what you're trying to build. Yeah.
Yeah, I do agree. I'm also very skeptical about BRICS. I'm not quite sure what it stands for. What sort of ideology underpins the idea of BRICS? Each country individually has its own interests. To large or less extent, we know what China is after. I'm not quite sure what Putin is after, or what he stands for after all. I mean, as whether he's a right-wing populist or whether he's traditional leftist, I just don't know. So what we see happening now is increasing polarization in world politics, diminishing power of the West, and the rise of middle power states, like, for instance, if you see in the case of Africa, much of the influence in the Horn of Africa, for instance, is coming from middle power states like UAE, Turkey, and so on. So I think that the two questions are interrelated in a way that previously, for instance, we have socialism, which underpins much of the internationalist movement, whether it is here, whether it is in North Africa, whether it's in Caribbean or Turkey. But now we don't really have that. I mean, even here in the context of Britain, I mean, where is the working class? Who is the working class? What the working class stands for? Pan-Africanism was a movement which was very much supported by, for example, the Independent Labour Party, and other, the British Communist Party and so on. Now what we see is completely kind of the reverse. The working class is moving towards, figures like Nigel Farage and the Brexit and so on. So I'm sorry, I'm a bit pessimistic. So I feel like we don't have the mobilization, the ideology which could kind of contribute for sort of revolution that would that we wish to see, and that would possibly create a much more egalitarian world system for everyone. I mean, the way in which the states are structured is Westphalian system, it's a nation state. And within that, I think the system is very, very, very fractured. And I think because of that, I think I am a bit unconvinced about the idea of BRICS. Russia, for instance, if you see Russia and Ukraine as we speak, they are fighting in Sudan. The Russians are supporting the Buran government, the Sudanese government, and the Ukrainians are fighting the Russian special forces in support of the rapid support forces. I mean, Africa is still a playground for not only for the West, but also what we traditionally call the East. And then you bring in BRICS in this. What does it mean? I'm not quite sure.
Great. So shall we take a round of questions? You can say who you are as well.
Hi, I am Eric. I'm a second year student here at LSE, and I wanted to ask why the British, French, American, and Chinese capitalists from all over the world are making billions every year in Africa, but in these nations themselves, in the UK, for example, we have 1/3 of children here in the UK growing up in poverty, public services in a shambles, and I wanted to ask the speakers, what can we here in Britain, and we have seen the class struggle come back, I would say, with like the 2022 summer of strikes. What can we here in Britain do to fight back against the imperialists robbing Africa? And this is related to the fact that more and more people here are being pushed to destitution in these imperial nations.
Should we take a round of three? Yes.
Yeah, I would like to. Yeah, I'm Mohammed. I'm studying development studies here in the postgrad. And actually, was by this way forward, right? We've seen the Chinese play the game very smartly in the capitalist system. And now they are developing, they are rising. I think we as Africans should do that as well. Really play the game because the reasons are very very nice to read. And at the end, what you mentioned as well about the regional economic communities, finding rising production, etc. Those are all the steps that are required to do, and we need strong governments to do that, and the masses will follow and support them. They are doing this in the Sahel, by the way. And it's quite, I think they really set the example as the new generation of African leaders of how we should all do it. I would like to hear your reflection on this.
I'm Lauren. I did my undergrad in IR and history, and I now work in the Students' Union. I just wanted to ask about, obviously we were talking about nation states in Africa, and to shift the focus to the Caribbean, where France still maintains departments, like Martinique, Guadeloupe, etc., and how this idea of revolution, class-based revolution, would affect the dynamics of these departments. Yeah, and kind of where you see, like, prospective arguments fit into, yeah, the realities that play out in, like, the departments, yeah, overseas departments.
We'll answer those three and then do another round.
Yeah, in terms of the fight against imperialism when you're within an imperialist country and to stop it, conducting imperialism elsewhere, obviously the Palestine movement has been, you know, a kind of shining example of that in the last year or so. The mass struggle and mass action is the only thing that any ruling class will ever listen to. It's the only thing they respond to. They don't respond to moralistic arguments. The idea that any form of decolonization or the abolition of slavery or anything like this has ever been the product of an ideological change in the mindset of those in power is totally false and a rewriting of history. All of that change has been the product of the mass movement of people themselves. But then, yeah, clearly, well, you know, where's the mass movement? Is the mass movement going to take place? And people will be more or less optimistic of the possibilities of that. I think what is significant about today, in terms of the fight against imperialism, in the past, when capitalism was in a stronger position, it was much easier for the ruling class to kind of buy off sections of the labor movement into supporting imperialism, into supporting the idea of the British Empire, that in some way this also benefited you as the workers in Britain, the role that Britain's playing on the world stage, or the same might be true in America. And I think what's important, and this is maybe sometimes hard, is not to think about this in a moralistic way, in terms of how the working class moves and what motivates them. I would say today it's much harder for the ruling class of any Western imperialist country to convince its own working class that they benefit from imperialism. There is a deep anti-war sentiment in America, for example. And I think there is a deep anti-war sentiment in Britain as well. The majority of people do not support sending weapons to Israel or what Israel is doing, and do not support the British government's support of that. And that isn't because of a moral transformation in the consciousness of people, although, I mean, it is, but where did that transformation come from? It came from the conditions of capitalism getting worse in this country anyway, and austerity, and the fact that and in America, that's even more extreme. If you look at the floods that have just taken place, and the government saying, sorry, we can't give you any more money, but here's a couple extra billion to Israel, here's a couple extra billion to Ukraine. That is too much for people to cope with. And so what is necessary is for some kind of labor movement leadership or revolutionary leadership, I would argue, to take advantage of that. Because the alternative is the right wing can take advantage of that. Actually, the AfD in Germany just won seats off the back of complaining about the money that was being given to Ukraine by Germany, right? So there is this polarization, I believe, taking place in politics where the middle ground, the center ground is kind of collapsing. The question is what political forces are gonna give voice to the things that can actually solve people's problems. In that vacuum, you'll have people like Nigel Farage or Trump. Trump is considered an anti-war, because part of the thing that Trump runs on is this idea that he had no wars when he was in power, and people are sick of wars. So I think there's this cruel irony that there's never actually been a better time to make the positive anti-imperialist message and connect it with necessary demands. I would argue that the fight against British imperialism in Britain is the fight to improve the conditions of the working class in Britain, to say why it's the fight for better wages, for better housing, to fund the NHS, education. And if you make that argument in a positive, concrete way, that's how you go beyond a movement of just, those who are most concerned with what they're seeing in front of us, whether it's Palestine or anywhere else, to a movement that can actually change what's taking place. So that's what I'd say about the fight against British imperialism. In terms of the future for African countries, I don't think that the example that should be followed is China. Personally, it's true China has risen and is a very powerful capitalist country, but that is also off the back of super exploitation of the Chinese working class who face, terrible conditions. And inequality and anger within Chinese society is growing massively as well. I think that you were talking about in the Caribbean and where France still has control. I take a lot of inspiration also from Amilcar Cabral and how he viewed the revolutionary struggle when he was trying actually to connect. He appealed directly to Portuguese soldiers and said, on whose orders do you fight for and who does this benefit? And there's this really powerful speech that he gave all about this. And it's basically trying to connect the struggles of the exploited masses of the colonial countries with the working class within the imperial countries, and trying to make the argument that our struggle ultimately is the same. But to make that argument is difficult. Because of all of the propaganda and the barriers that exist in the imperialist countries first and foremost. But I think that today there is this, because the conditions of capitalism are so dire, we can make that argument. And I think that argument has to be made. And that is internationalism at the end of the day, is to show people concretely, you do not benefit from imperialism, you do not benefit from this. But ultimately, our job in the imperialist countries is to stop our own imperialist powers, but it's the struggle of the masses themselves in those countries to then take their power for themselves. And we should just support that.
Yeah, I do agree. I think I don't have much to add. I think that you raised a very good question and about working class, condition of the working class in Britain and the condition of people in Africa. I think it's very, very, very much similar. But unfortunately, I think that's not how politics is being conducted in Britain at the moment. And it seems to me to kind of invoke Lenin. The working class in Britain doesn't seem to know its interests. Its problem is blamed on immigrants, asylum seekers, people who look different, and so on, rather than the kind of the growing inequality between the rich and the poor. So that's what's lacking actually. It's not about the base for the revolution is for the working class, whether you are based in Asia, Africa, or in Britain, to understand that you have a lot to in common with people, working class people in Africa than the rich 1% in Britain or in America. So I think that relates back to the lack of internationalism that once defined the Pan-African movement or the socialist internationalism that was 1970s and before. The question about regional economic communities in Africa, that's it has a very complex history. Nkrumah was against regional economic communities, but the trend now is to copy the European Union as a model for the African Union and regional economic communities with this ECOWAS, East African Community, or the Southern African Economic Community, COMESA. We have quite a lot of them in Africa. To me, they are vehicles of implementing neoliberal policies of free trade, free movement of people. I don't have any problem with that. I actually support free trade and free movement of people. But the ideology which underpins it is not anti-imperialism. It's rather neoliberalism. And at some point, South Africa was, well, after it emerged out of apartheid, then the South African business community was behind the idea of promoting regional economic community and so on for its own economic interests. And Mbeki, as much as I admire him, he pushed for it, but wasn't very much successful. It's not, we haven't seen much success. So we don't have a regional economic community based on the traditional principles of, anti-imperialist, pro-African, a condition which, boosts African agency both within the continent but also outside. I think that relates with the case of the Caribbean, the Martinique, and I'm not an expert on the Caribbean politics, but in my reading, the previous generations, Senghor and Emi were very idealistic, very Ethiopian. They wanted to liberate France and decolonize France, not just Martinique or or Senegal or French, as has been described. History taught us that I believe revolutions should start from here, from as Marx went from capitalist countries rather than from Africa or the Caribbean. But that's what they were trying to do, to kind of start the revolution from the colonies and liberate France and create an egalitarian federation of France and Caribbean and African countries. Well, what we have now is Franc-Afrique, and the French power is very, very well entrenched. French imperialism, as has been, France is very, very shameless. We can debate British imperialism, we can debate American liberal internationalism, and so on. French one is just yeah. Yeah. So they still use franc. Some French companies pay their taxes in Paris, not in Africa. And the franc is pegged against euro, and it's very, very blatant. And I'm not quite sure. I don't know what to say, but except that MEC's very idealistic projects of liberating kind of France and make the Caribbean as equal partners was very, very, to be honest, a bit naive in my point of view. It just doesn't take into account how power works and how real politics works in natural reality. Yeah.
Let's take a final round.
Yeah, so for my question, this is a bit more with Fiona. So my question, I'll start my question and I'll go to the context of it. So don't you think we keep engaging in revolutionary movements and positions that the West hate rather than trying to dispose of them? Because when you talk about multipolarity being a problem, that kind of, it doesn't, for me, it hurts me. And I think it's because of the fact that when you think of the African continent, you think of Pan-Africanism. We are talking about how, the West goes about extracting our resources, super extracting our resources, and that we need to engage in a way where we can provide power for ourselves, to liberate ourselves, and to actually be the center for the power that we need. So when you're saying that multipolarity in a world which we live in, which is very much mono, singular, doesn't essentially, you don't want multipolarity. It kind of doesn't, I don't quite understand that. And the second point would be, in response to this, we talk about coups and the coup in Burkina Faso being hypocritical. But to me, when you're dealing with colonizers that have nuclear energy, that use violence, that use terror, You see what's happening in Panama, you see what's happening in Congo. You need violence in order to, you need to organize violence by communities in order to create, essentially, the communities of violence that can create the best conditions. So I'm quite, I don't quite get that. And my last point, just to kind of add just in response to it, is more so about the narratives. And I think in the West, we have to be very careful because the narrative that we constantly see on what we constantly see on news waves and stuff like that is very much, is very xenophobic. So when you're saying things like China extremely capitalist and are terrible and so on and so forth, yet when we see on the news, you see that the Palestinian resistance, China's been supporting it, and so so I think we have to be very careful of our lines here. The same thing you can say with Iran. Iran, a lot of people say lots of things about Iran. Iran is this, Iran is that. But who's doing the work for the Palestinian resistance? Isn't Iran doing a lot of work there? So to me, I think there needs to be really careful, rather than very cautious. I'm saying this, especially in the West. So that's my question.
And then back here. Here.
All right,
You just want to say who you are.
mine is just, I don't even speak, you did make the point about what is the way out. How can Africa extricate itself from all this exploitation? You came to meet here, you have come to meet here. How can Africa at some point extricate itself from this exploitation by colonial powers, given that the colonial financial architecture is still there? Is there any hope that Africa can extricate itself from this exploitation? And again, to be able to get yourself out of this, people come and exploit your resources, which is mainly minerals, because you don't have the technology to extract it. So they come, bring their technology, give you a percentage, and take the rest. So if they don't bring it, you cannot extract it. Now, for all these years, what have you done to develop the technology to be able to extract your own minerals? After all these centuries that people come, different races come to your continent, exploit the minerals that you have. And the reason why you cannot do it, you don't have the technology. Why are you not building the R&Ds? The only reason why the others have the technology is because they research. You don't do. If you are vulnerable, somebody take advantage of you. At what point will you make yourself less vulnerable for others to take advantage of you?
Yeah, just a quick one from me, actually follows on quite well from that question. The role of technology in the struggle to change this power imbalance. I wondered if, we've spoken a lot about the imperial centre's political changes and the potential for that to elicit some sort of electoral demands for this to shift. But I wondered if the technological shifts that are sort of prevalent throughout the world today are changing the likelihood of progress here. Are they entrenching capitalist power throughout the sorts of technologies that we're considering, or are there some technologies which potentially offer a way to make progress?
My question's relatively affiliated, and it was, you take DRC as an example, what do you think should be done or needs to be done to remove the barriers, freedom, which were created by colonialism, to allow self-led empowerment to flourish?
Final question.
I have a question that do you think Africa is better off without Chinese investment, or it's better than that?
There, questions, and then back to you for the final. The relief.
Okay, I'm gonna try and answer this question about, is Africa better off with China? and it's related to the question that was asked there. Although there was a lot of different things in what you asked that I don't think I can go into everything to do with the Palestinian resistance in Iran and all of the forces and the different players involved in that. Let me just start by saying, look, the perspective I come from is trying to find just an analysis of what is the world today. It's not a moralistic thing of, do I think this is nice or good or right? Of course, in a struggle, what I am interested in looking at is the class balance of forces at play, and in whose interests are people fighting for and working for, right? That is how I form the framework of analyzing something. And it's on that basis that I would say what China is doing in Africa is imperialist. It's not a moralistic thing. It's not a moralistic condemnation of whether or not I think China is good or bad or terrible or anything like this. If you study the export of Chinese capital and companies and what they do, that is how I form the basis of saying that it's imperialist. Because imperialism to me, although, yeah, I am morally outraged by what it creates and what it does, I'm coming at it from a Marxist perspective and trying to do so, therefore, from a scientific perspective. I don't think it's useful to think of things in the framework of necessarily good and bad. Is what China is doing in Africa good? The question is for who? Are the masses of Africa, are their conditions getting better in general in the current period that we're living in? I would say no. It's true that China gives loans to different countries and it provides things and sets up different infrastructure in different ways. But in the long term, in whose interest is that for? It's first and foremost for the Chinese companies that are involved in that. And then it's also for the governments of those countries that are able to scrape off what they can from the top of those agreements and contracts. In terms of the people, the working class, the masses on the ground, they are not the ones that benefit from China. It's a small layer of people who do. And again, I'm trying to say that not from a moralistic point of view, but an analysis of the conditions in which people live. And this is again linked to this question of multipolarity, like, oh, am I annoyed, or why do I not support BRICS, or why do I not support multipolarity? It's because ultimately I'm against the capitalist system, and I'm against trying to reform or find nicer ways within the capitalist system as a way to fight off American imperialism or Western imperialism as a whole. I do not think that is possible, and I'm not interested in trying to support smaller or greater or different capitalist powers within that struggle. I think that's important because, and I say that because I come at it from a Marxist perspective and a class perspective. And also, I don't think we can base our opinion on countries or governments on if they, this idea of, we have to be very careful about this idea of this or that regime or this or that government supports the Palestinian resistance in this or that way. It is, I mean, we can look at what Iran is doing and in trying to fight against the Zionist state of Israel, which is necessary. I think, by the way, a revolutionary war is what is necessary in terms of fighting against Israel. But I'm getting distracted now. There are a lot of governments that can pay lip service to the struggle of the Palestinians without really materially doing what is necessary. And we've got to kind of look beyond this battle. And I think this is important in terms of the time we live in. It's like there's a battle of cultures. And that is kind of where this BRICS argument comes into things. It's like the global South rising against Western imperialism, as though it's a battle of two cultures. And that can very quickly slip into not really having a class analysis of the world and not having a class understanding of in whose interests are these people fighting for. I think the liberation of the working class is an act of the working class itself, not greater benevolent capitalist powers from other countries. And that's the standpoint I come from on that. And that's linked to this question of how can Africa free itself, and I guess also this question of technology. I think, look, capitalism, although it is based on immense misery, barbarism, exploitation, slavery, has actually produced incredible technologies. And it did at a certain time in history play a progressive role. And what I mean by that is like a development of the productive forces, a development of literally the technology that we have. The problem is, under capitalism, that technology is privately held, or it's used in the interests of a class that isn't going to invest in something or use that technology just for the betterment of humanity and to take things forward, but in the interest of profit and profit making. You know, the argument of a communist, I think, in response to that is that this technology should be democratically owned and used by the masses of people. I think there's this, you know, people talk about AI and all of this kind of stuff. I don't think that's necessarily what you're thinking about, but I think the argument is similar, which is AI could be a very useful thing in society, but the way it will be used under capitalism is to actually just cause problems in the economy and unemployment and so on and so forth, rather than being used to socially improve or like make menial jobs like done by technology, whilst other people can go on to fulfill themselves in different ways. The problem is capitalism, and under capitalism, no matter what technology is created, it will never be able to be used to fulfill the potential of humanity, because it will be dependent on the profits and the profit seeking of those who own it and control it. So yeah, and I'll just end again on this point that I think I'm a bit more optimistic about the perspectives for class struggle and the perspectives ultimately for revolution. I take great inspiration from the movement over the summer in Bangladesh, which started with students, and that spread to a whole revolution in which the prime minister was forced to flee. But the system remains, right? The system remains, and I think that is going to happen more and more. I think we will live through a time of revolutions and counter-revolutions until, in all of these countries, there is an organized force with a clear, conscious idea of what is it that we are building. It's not enough to be against capitalism. It's not enough to be against imperialism. I think you have to be for something. And my argument is obviously for a socialist economy, an economy that's planned, where you expropriate the biggest corporations and use all of that money and all of that wealth and all of that technology in the interests of the masses. That's what I'm fighting for, and that's what I'm interested in. Yeah.
Yeah. The way out for Africa. So I'm an academic. I really don't know the way out. Academics are terrible at solutions. You just do the analysis and policymakers do the. But to me, I mean, the exploitation which you have described is enabled by African leaders. Yeah, for instance, France, France election had been, funded by, wells from West Africa. Francois Mitterrand, for example, and even Sarkozy had been accused of money being given to him from Africa. Paul Biya, Cameroon president, he's over 90 now. He lives in Switzerland, I think, and this is the case across Africa in one or another way. Some African countries have practically lost their sovereignty, policy-making sovereignty. So their policy is formulated in Washington, or a young PhD, just recently PhD completed young person would go to Rwanda is much more stronger, Ugandan Minister of Finance, and they would dictate what to do and what not to do. I think Africa has to assert its agency. I mean, that's what Pan-Africanism is about. Pan-Africanism is not just creating unity for the sake of it. It's about, resisting, domination, which comes in different ways, through policy mechanisms, through whether it's economic domination and so on. I think we need to start from that, and then revolution is good, but I'm a bit skeptical. Maybe because I'm a bit older than you, I don't know. Technology, I mean, technology in one way is empowering for the youth. In the case of, for example, Sudan and Nigeria recently, and Kenya as well, is a very, very good example. But on the other hand, it also enables capitalist exploitation and expansion of imperialism in Africa.
not only from the West, but also from China. I have done a bit of research on the African Union, and as you know, the African Union Commission building is gifted by China, the Chinese government, to the African people. So I don't know why a continent of 55 countries is unable to build its own continental headquarters. It just costed like 200 million. It's not a lot of money, to be honest. But they gave it to China. Not only they gave it to China, the Chinese are responsible for maintaining. They still have office within the African Union compound. As you might have seen some years back, so the computer system, the servers were extremely busy in midnight, and it just turned out that the Chinese were siphoning off all the information out of the African Union to Shanghai, and then that's what I mean, taking back control and asserting sovereignty. And technology is one of the ways in which China is infiltrating. China is materially, to a certain extent, benefiting Africa. It is good, but it should be on terms that benefit Africa rather than dictated by. And one problem I have with China is that we always talk about China, Western imperialism, but at least they pay lip service to human rights, human dignity, and so on. Well, the practicality of it is a completely different story, as we have seen in the case of Gaza. But China is extremely transactional. There is no principle. Yesterday it was working with right-wing government, and it's changed today. And if you have a completely different government, then they will stand with that government. And if you see most of the investments that the Chinese are doing in Africa, it's usually around the village of the leader. And so I think there is an interesting research by economists which came out a few years ago that most of the Chinese investment are around the ethnic group, or village or place where the leaders are coming up. So it's not it's not like a good. It's very difficult to judge as if it's a good thing or a bad thing. But I personally am skeptical because of the transactional nature of Chinese diplomacy in the way in which it is doing it. But it has brought quite a lot of transformation in terms of infrastructure. If you see the case of Ethiopia, Rwanda, and in many other countries, but it has also its own problem of debt and so on. DRC, what should be done? That's also another. DRC is a very long, complicated problem. It has long history. I don't think the case of the DRC can only solved by the people of the DRC or the leadership of the DRC. And the DRC has, to some extent, we know the one of the problems they have is with Eastern DRC area, where Rwandans claim that the genociders fled there, and they're hiding and organizing to come back and overthrow the Kagame government. I think to a certain extent, personally, I feel like they should acknowledge that this somehow legitimates concern that Rwanda has, rather than opting for confrontation. But ultimately, I think the case of Congo can only be solved by regional effort, which involves all the southern frontier and Rwanda, Uganda, and other neighbors of the DRC. It's a really, really complicated case. Yeah, I think I've answered the case of China. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but there is a reception, right? There is a reception. So if you have any more questions or thoughts, please join me in thanking our speakers.
Yeah,
You wanna grab a bite?
Yeah, I'll go by. Yeah, if you're hungry.
Yeah.
Can I go to sleep?
You have to go back to the.
Yeah.
It's quite busy today, yeah? It's late, right? Yeah.
Did you have enjoyed that?
Yeah. You back to the office to, you know, up in the world order, or are you going back to the office to up in the world order?
Actually, I'm going to the Moroccan embassy to meet the ambassador.
Many to hear.
There is this Moroccan guy.
Whatever's close.
Yeah, I think I'm not gonna have a chat.
He's a filmmaker.